Hello, fellow soil stewards and gardening enthusiasts. Welcome back to the Humus Heritage, where we dig deep into the mysteries that make our gardens thrive. Today we're exploring something that, might sound like folklore but actually holds fascinating truths about the creatures that power our compost bins and enrich our soil. We're talking about earthworms and their curious relationship with the moon, moisture, and the ancient rhythms that govern life beneath our feet. The hidden rhythms of your worm bin. Most gardeners understand the basics of composting: add organic matter, maintain moisture, ensure proper aeration, and let the worms do their magic. But there's a deeper layer to this process that, honestly, few consider. Your worm bin isn't just a contained ecosystem operating in isolation. It's influenced by forces that extend far beyond its wooden or plastic walls. While we obsess over carbon to nitrogen ratios and bedding materials, nature operates on frequencies we rarely acknowledge. The earthworms in your garden and compost system are responding to environmental cues that have guided their behavior for millions of years, and understanding these patterns can transform how you approach soil management. The connection between lunar cycles and earthworm activity isn't about mysticism. It's about recognizing that these creatures evolved in sync with planetary rhythms that still influence their behavior today. Lunar lore and living soil. For centuries, farmers and gardeners have observed correlations between lunar phases and agricultural productivity. Long before modern science could explain gravitational forces, indigenous peoples named the full moon of March the worm moon, because it marked the time when earthworms began appearing as the soil thawed, signaling spring's arrival and the return of robins to feast on this protein-rich emergence. This naming wasn't random. It reflected careful observation of natural patterns that governed planting and harvesting schedules. The moon's gravitational pull creates ocean tides, raising billions of tons of water twice daily, and while the effect on soil moisture is far more subtle, the principle remains scientifically valid. Just as the moon influences water movement in large bodies, it exerts measurable effects on groundwater and soil moisture distribution, creating micro-variations in the subterranean environment where earthworms spend most of their lives. Early agricultural researchers documented increased earthworm surface activity during certain lunar phases, though they often lacked the instruments to measure the precise mechanisms driving this behavior. Earthworms experience their world through their skin, which serves as both their respiratory system and their primary sensory organ. When heavy rains saturate the soil, a common misconception suggests that worms surface to avoid drowning, but the reality is more nuanced. Earthworms can actually survive in water-saturated soil as long as oxygen remains dissolved in that water. They surface during and after rains because the moisture creates ideal conditions for overland migration, allowing them to travel farther and faster than they could through dense, dry soil. This is when they search for new territories, seek mates, and explore food sources beyond their usual range. Moonlight plays a fascinating role in this equation. Earthworms conduct most surface activities under darkness because predators like birds, who hunt visually, pose the greatest threat during daylight hours. However, the intensity of moonlight matters significantly. During the new moon, when darkness is most complete, certain earthworm species show increased surface activity because the risk of predation drops substantially. Conversely, during full moons, the brighter nighttime conditions can suppress surface movement in some populations, as the additional light increases vulnerability. This behavioral adaptation demonstrates how earthworms have evolved to balance their need for surface migration with survival imperatives shaped by predator-prey dynamics. Understanding these lunar moisture connections offers some pretty practical advantages for managing your worm bins and garden soil. You might want to consider timing your compost feeding schedules to align with moisture patterns that naturally increase worm activity. When you know rain is forecasted around the new moon phase, you're honestly looking at optimal conditions for worm movement and feeding efficiency. This is an excellent time to add fresh food scraps to your bin, since the worms will be more active and process materials more quickly. Similarly, if you're planning to harvest worm castings, doing so a few days after significant rainfall during darker moon phases means you'll encounter more active worms that are actually easier to separate from finished compost. Pay attention to how your local earthworm populations respond to these combined factors by keeping a simple observation journal. Just note when you see the most surface casting activity in your garden beds, correlate these observations with recent weather patterns and moon phases, and you'll begin detecting patterns specific to your microclimate and local worm species. So, this kind of empirical approach, well, it actually transforms you from just a passive gardener into an active researcher, really deepening your connection with the living systems that support and sustain your plants. The earthworm-moon connection. You know, it reminds us that successful gardening goes way beyond just following rigid formulas. It really calls for developing a sensitivity to the subtle interconnections that make healthy ecosystems possible. When we start to realize that something as distant as the moon can influence creatures as humble as earthworms, through its effects on things like moisture cycles and light availability, we begin to appreciate, honestly, the profound complexity of the natural world. You know, this perspective really shifts our role from being dominators trying to control nature to collaborators working within its established rhythms. Every organism in your garden, from the microscopic bacteria breaking down organic matter to the earthworms aerating your soil, operates according to ancient patterns refined through evolutionary time. By observing these patterns, instead of, imposing our will against them, we actually create more resilient and productive growing systems that require less intervention and, honestly, yield better results. The moon doesn't directly command earthworms to surface, but it definitely influences the environmental conditions that govern their behavior, just as it affects countless other natural processes we're only beginning to understand. So, if this exploration has sparked your curiosity about the hidden connections in your garden, please subscribe to the Humus Heritage and share this video with fellow gardeners who appreciate the deeper mysteries of soil life. Leave a comment sharing your own observations about earthworm behavior in your garden or compost bins. Together, we can build a community of mindful gardeners who work with nature's rhythms rather than against them.